thank you for having us. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, it's lovely to see you all. I'm sorry I can't be there in person, but thank you to the Newport Historical Society for beaming me in via satellite for tonight. Yeah, we're excited to talk about Ida and chat with all of you. So I'll let Lenore run it in person, but happy to be here. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Nico. And thank you all, really. This is your hometown heroine. This is your darling. This is the person you can lay claim to. It is really important for Nico and I to be here tonight to kick off the tour, predominantly because Ida is from Newport. And honestly, I think she's the best thing you guys have ever produced. No offense to the mansions. Kayla, I think we want to take this back. Kayla, I think we want to take this back to the slideshow. So we're here for Ida Lewis. I'm sure some of you have lots of knowledge of Ida Lewis. Some of you have very little knowledge of Ida Lewis. It doesn't really matter. We are going to talk about all aspects of this dear woman and why you should be super proud of her, because we certainly are. Nico and I met because of Ida Lewis and our love for her and our belief that she should be somebody that's in the history books. She is an accomplished, amazing human being, and what makes her even more appealing, I think, to all of us in this day and age is that she didn't want any of this. She's not an influencer. She didn't care about nude photos of herself. She really just did her job. She did it well, and celebrity just came by happenstance. And honestly, I don't even think she liked it, and I know that she never got accustomed to it. So, as you see here, this is the cover of, it's not the cover of my book, but this is Ida Lewis, and there's the Lighthouse, as you can see. Lighthouse Keeper's daughter, that's what Ida Lewis was for the majority of her life, quite frankly. And there was nothing unique about that, because there were hundreds of Lighthouse Keeper's daughters. I mean, they were prolific, because lighthouses, that's how we navigated the seas. And so why is she so deserving? Why did I write the book? Why do we have a movie that we're pitching for her about her life? It's because she, in addition to taking care of the light and making sure that thousands and thousands of mariners made it to harbor safely, she rescued people physically, and she did it without any thought in her head that I shouldn't be doing this. I'm a 5'3" woman, I'm 103 pounds, and I'm hauling men that are twice my size out of the frozen water. It never even occurred to her that this was something that was unusual, because in her mind she was just doing her job. And against her wishes, she was catapulted to celebrity. She was born as Ida Wally Zaradia Lewis. Zaradia is her mom's name. And it's kind of a strange name, quite frankly. But that was her given name. She loved everything about the sea. Part of that was because of her father. And we'll get into his history in a little bit. But at a young age, she was an adept swimmer. And we have to remember the time period and try to keep that in mind as we talk tonight, because we're talking about the 1800s, the mid-1800s, a very different time period than what we're thinking of right now. Swimming was not a recreational sport. It was not something that people did competitively. Swimming was a survival skill. It was for sailors, it was for mariners, it was people that were out at sea, and they would die if they didn't know how to swim. So for Ida to know how to swim and compete against other boys just because it was something that was fun to do was unheard of. And it was not very ladylike, let's put it that way. She also was an accomplished oarswoman by the time she was 12, 13 years old. Boats back then were very big, oars were very heavy, and Ida was very accomplished at this as well. Again, this was not a female sport. There were no female sports. So the fact that she had these sort of tomboy qualities, which is probably how we would describe it today, we want to look back on that and sort of figure out where all of that came from. Sorry about that. This is where she was born. And some of you are familiar with this house. There's a plaque, as you can see here on the slide. She was born February 25th of 1842 on Spring Street. She was one of 4 surviving children. Her eldest brother, Horatio, had died at the age of 10. Ida was several years younger than him. This was a milestone in Ida Lewis's life and in her trajectory, because she was treated by Hosea, her father, as the eldest boy. And I think that's where sort of that her predisposition to be kind of athletic and to be interested in sort of outdoor activities was fed by maybe this expectation of her dad, that this would be the boy that they lost. And it had to have been a huge tragedy for that family, by the way. So consequently, she was also physically strong. Again, a slight person, but her physical strength was there. She was, she was extremely strong, quite frankly. And it was not anything that I think her father actually paid any attention to, because he never really treated her any differently than he would have if she had been a boy. Unfortunately, and her dad back in the day, for those of you who know your history, he was a pilot of the Revenue Cutter Service. The Revenue Cutter Service was the predecessor to the Coast Guard. All right, so that was the service where they sort of patrolled the shorelines, and they ensured that there was no pirating, that people were upholding the customs laws, and also they were in charge of rescue, search and rescue. So Ida obviously learned a lot from her father at a very young age. Because of ill health, though, he had to retire. Actually, he was asked to quit because he had hit a bad heart. So in 1853, he quit the cutter service, and they offered him a job as a lighthouse keeper on the newly built Lime Rock Light, which was basically just a short stone tower with an oil-burning lantern that had a 6-degree Fresnel lens. Ida accompanied her dad to go back and forth to the light, because they were living at Spring Street. There was no house or anything there. It was just the light. And he had to go out twice a day, obviously, to light the lamp and then to extinguish it when daylight came. She was 12 years old. The Lewises, thankfully, got to move to the light, because this had been strenuous. But in all of those trips back and forth, I'm sure Hosea imparted to her a lot of what he knew about rescue, about keeping a cool head during rescue, which is Ida was known for, not losing it, and to be able to just physically pull someone in over the stern of the boat, and a lot of the specifics of how you actually rescue somebody. And all of this stayed with Ida, and would come to great use in the future, by the way. Her family moved to Lime Rock in 1857 when the house was completed, that the Lighthouse Board thought we should have somebody full-time there, because it was a pretty important navigational aid. Ida, her 2 younger brothers, Hosea and Rudolph, and her youngest sister, Hattie, her mother, Zeradia, and her father, Hosea. She's quoted as saying about that time, "I enjoy life in a lighthouse. It has the advantage of not having any next-door neighbors." Kind of gives you insight into the woman, doesn't it? And here's a little bit of a rendition. I think this is from Putnam Magazine after she had gotten famous. And you can see her with her father and her mother here, and she's looking out at the harbor. Lighthouses were the primary source of navigation in that time period. The men maintaining them made very little money. Lighthouse keepers' salaries ranged from $300 to $550 a year. Today's currency, that'd be about $10,000 to $17,000. They were appointed positions, men only. So many times there were political favors. And somebody had a son, a nephew, a ne'er-do-well, and they're like, okay, let's give them a position. So since they didn't pay well, a lot of the lighthouse keepers had to have second jobs. So many times they were lobstermen, they were oystermen, they were fishermen, which left very little time to tend the light. So consequently, wives and daughters took on those responsibilities. Hence why Ida was not unique in this capacity. There were many daughters of lighthouse keepers that had to take over the light. In Ida's case, she loved it. She absolutely loved it. She was 15 years old when they moved to the island, a young girl, a teenager, and she was thrilled to be able to be a part of it. Little did she know, 4 months into living on that island, Hosea had a massive stroke. It basically left him incapacitated. I mean, he could move around, but he couldn't cut his own food. He couldn't care for himself. And obviously that responsibility fell on his wife, Zeradia. And who's going to take care of the light? And the children. So Ida was charged with rowing the kids back and forth to school, because school was on the mainland, and also tending to the light while her mother took care of her father and the household chores. And just as a side note, lighthouse keepers had to keep those lighthouses in impeccable shape, because inspectors could come at any time and do a surprise visit. If there was any dust, there was a citation listed. So it was no joke. It was a very stressful job, mundane but stressful. So this was Ida's life at 15. Young girl, 15 years old, taking care of the light, taking care of her family members. Fairly mundane, hard labor, long hours, but a woman passionate and dedicated to what she was doing. Her life probably would have stayed that way, uncomplicated, not noteworthy. We wouldn't even be sitting here talking about her today if it hadn't been for one incident. We're going to scroll forward, ladies and gentlemen, to 1869. Ida is now 27. Rest assured that between the time she was 15 and the time she was 27, there were many rescues, 5 of which we know about. The world does not know about them. No one knew about them. No one even knew who Ida Lewis was. Because you have to remember something, Newport back then was sort of like a caste system. The robber barons hadn't really started coming in yet. They hadn't built the big mansions. It was more of an artist colony. Nobody really cared about her. She was a lighthouse keeper's daughter, whatever. So when all of this happened, I just want you to sort of keep that in your mind, because this is such a shock. You can, to imagine Ida, all of this happening to her, never anticipating this. She could have been completely happy just being a lighthouse keeper till the day she died. Well, in 1869, and we refer to this as the famous rescue of 1869, it was March 29th, okay? Ida's 27. And let's see, what's the slide we have up here? I want to show you the slide of the fort. Okay, this is important. I'm sure most of you know about this harbor, but it's important to sort of, this is circa 1850, this map, by the way. Ida's 27, Fort Adams, which is on the corner there, as you can see, it was an active fort at the time. The Civil War, remember, just ended 5 years prior, or 4 years prior. It was active. It had still become just like a recruitment depot for the 15th Infantry Regiment. That's where they trained soldiers. At the time of this incident, there were probably 200 soldiers there. During war, there would have been 2,400. All right, so here's your setup. And it was very common for these soldiers who wanted to go down and around to Thames Street, where the brothels were, the bars, the pubs, what have you, on leave, to walk over there and, you know, have some drinks, and then not want to go all the way back to Fort Adams, especially, you know, when there's a winter storm coming in and there's gale winds and God knows what else. So this is the March 29th rescue. So these 2 soldiers decided to go to town, took the long way around, and drank their faces off. And then they figured, oh, I need to get back to Fort to report on time. Nico?
Yeah, so the 2 soldiers that essentially changed Ida's life were Sergeant James Adams and Private John McLaughlin. And they had hired a boy to sail them back across the harbor, a teenager who proved to not be as skilled of a sailor as he had let on. So when a strong winter storm set in, their boat capsized. The boy couldn't quite handle the boat, and he ended up dying. And the soldiers barely survived, clinging to the hull. Now, Zoraida saw that the boat was listing in the water from the lantern room and called to Ida, who fled immediately to the rescue without putting on a coat or shoes. She only grabbed a towel and tied it around her neck on the way out the door, even though she was still ill at the time. Now, history tends to omit that her little brother, Hosea Jr., was also in the boat with her. She really gets all the attention for it. He was also there, but she really commanded the rescue and got both soldiers back to the lighthouse. Even though she did fall more ill after that rescue and it took her weeks to regain her health, she still rowed both men back to Fort Adams the next morning. So that was March 29th. By July 4th, only 4 months later, Ida was a celebrity, not just locally, but nationally. So how did this happen? Well, Fort Adams likely reported the incident, and the customs collector caught word of that. And so the account would have been then reported locally, which would have been telegrammed to newspapers in New York City. Now, upon reading that report, the New York Tribune sent a reporter to Newport and on to Lime Rock Light to meet with Ida and her family for an interview. Now, that New York Tribune article was published on April 14th, 1869, and it said some very flowery things about Ida, some of her best accolades to date. I'm going to read you a quote from that article. "In the opinion of the best judges, no truer or more fearless heroine than Ida Lewis ever found a place in the annals of any humane society on either side of the Atlantic, and none more unselfish ever received honors for those whose position or wealth enables them to crown meritorious acts with suitable rewards." Now that's a review. So the national papers then picked up and ran that story. And so why did that story resonate nationally and spread like wildfire? It's important to know some historical context, which I believe maybe Elizabeth mentioned at the beginning, but there are 3 things going on in the country. The first is that we were in the early Reconstruction era. So the country was ripped apart by the Civil War. People were searching for hope, for new heroes, preferably ones found outside of wartime. There's also the development of the wire service, which dates back to the late 1830s and had been localized but not widely utilized until the Civil War changed that, because there was a desire for news and battle coverage, and that dramatically increased wire service and news being spread. So that is also happening a lot more regularly, which allowed the story of Ida to spread. And then, of course, there's the women's suffrage movement, which was gaining steam both politically and culturally. And it had expanded into other issues, like including abolition and the right for freed Black men to vote and temperance. And it just so happens that in the summer of 1869, the Women's Suffrage Association conference was being held in Newport. So there's a confluence of things going on. And July 4th, 1869 is really when Ida is propelled to fame and marks the end of her life as she knew it and kind of the end of life as the whole Lewis family knew it. On July 4th, the town of Newport hosted an event in her honor and presented her with a new rowboat that they paraded through town. They called it Ida Lewis Day, and 4,000 people came to hear Ida and others speak. Well, she didn't speak. She let other men speak for her. She stood up there timidly and awkwardly and didn't say a peep. As Colonel Higginson said, who spoke on her behalf, all the money in these United States would not pay her to make a show of herself. So finally, Ida was presented with Rescue, which was this 14-foot long oak and cedar rowboat, which the Historical Society has, and Lenore and I have seen, which was very cool. But Ida hated that boat. She thought it was heavy and unyieldy, was not a boat that you would use in a rescue, was not really a boat that was like functional for a sailor or an oarsman. And they made her row off in it back to the lighthouse after the ceremony. But at least she got back home and thought, well, at least all that's over with. I don't have to deal with any of that craze anymore. Well, unfortunately for her, the craze was just beginning, because that summer, Lime Rock Light and her home became besieged by tourists. I mean, basically the house became a tourist attraction. Her family were forced to provide free tours for guests who would steal things from the house. They received countless gifts. And then the accolades started rolling in. So the Rhode Island General Assembly recognized her as a hero of the state, which I believe that letter is actually on display behind all of you, which the Historical Society has. The Cirrhosis Society, the first women's club based in New York City, also made her an honorary member. The Astors and Vanderbilts and all the wealthy elite of Newport came to visit, but of course, none of them have ever invited Ida to their homes up on the hill. She became the subject of paintings and photographs and poetry and songs. She received offers to travel with a vaudeville act who were willing to pay her $1,500, to which she responded, "I am neither a double-headed girl nor a Siamese twin, so I will not do it." She suffered pranksters who would fake drownings so that she would have to come rescue them. She received dozens of marriage proposals, hundreds of visitors in a day. Her father, Hosea, would mark in his journal each visitor that they had each day. And by the end of that summer, it was estimated that they had 10,000 people who came by to see them. Not least of which was General Sherman, who was home from the Civil War and came to see Ida because he wanted to know what a female hero looked like. Also, Vice President Schuyler Colfax met her in plain clothes, didn't want her to know who he was so that she could meet him without pretense. She was appalled to find out who he was after he left the island and felt like she had not presented herself with enough decorum. The Secretary of the Treasury came to visit her because he was proud to have a woman in his department who was not finicky about getting her hair wet, he said. Elizabeth Cady Stanton came with a party to try to recruit her to be the face of the women's suffrage movement, because the association was obviously having their conference. And President Ulysses Grant was given a tour of the island. And he said, "I want to see Ida Lewis, and to do so, I'd get wet up to my armpits." So all of these visitors, no matter how reputable, Ida made a comment in the press about how all these men, all their speeches kind of sound the same. And of the not so famous visitors, she minced words even less. She was quoted in the Newport Daily News as having described the whole summer as impertinent visits of sightseeing jackasses. So she was clearly getting tired of all the attention and of having to tell her story over and over again, which is probably why she allowed journalist George Brewerton to publish a biography of her, the only one that she officially authorized. Sorry, Lenore. But it recounts her various rescues in her own words, which are really Brewerton's words, which are pretty flowery. This is actually a copy of the biography that he wrote of her. It's pretty lengthy, and but it's very fun. So they would have these little booklets of this biography out on the island that she would hand out with postcards, so that probably she didn't have to tell people her story anymore, and she could just hand those over to people. So she really was famous for being the keeper of Lime Rock, but it was only in name. Her father was still technically the keeper, and she was famous for being a thing that she wasn't. She was still just a single woman, basically a spinster, who was facing a lot of pressure to get married and leave the island behind.
And to that point, Ida's one true love throughout her life was the light. She took her responsibilities as lighthouse keeper extremely seriously. So all of the stuff that happened in the summer of '69 was just a big nuisance to her. And she really thought it would just go away, you know, that she'd be queen for a day and that'd be that. She's quoted as saying, "The light is my child. I know when it needs me, even when I sleep." Now, why is that? Seems sort of strange. Yes, she was, by all accounts, a spinster, but it's important to understand that as a lighthouse keeper, Ida was acutely aware that keeping the light lit kept mariners safe. It kept them, and in her mind, and she wrote about this, and I actually have a quote, she says, "There are hundreds of boats going in and out of this harbor, and it's part of my happiness to know that they are depending on me to guide them safely." She took that super seriously. I mean, this was a very important theme in her life. So nothing underscored this more than when she actually did marry. And usually we don't talk about her marriage in the talk just because it was a blip on the radar, and she never talked about it. But it's something that Nico and I did a deep dive into, and we still don't have all of the answers, but we will, as God is my witness. She married a man called William Hurd Wilson in 1870. So the timeline is she's famous in 1869. She had been engaged to this guy for 3 years. Now, I don't care when you were born, 3 years is a long time to be engaged. And that says to me, you ain't wanting to get married. So she gets famous, and so we sort of speculate that maybe the marriage was hastened because she's like, oh crap, let me get married, and maybe the shift will be off of me for a little bit. William was he is a yachtsman, but that's not in the conventional term of the word yachtsman. He was actually a for-hire pilot. And so you'd hire him to sail your boat around or whatever. So he had a lot of dealings between his hometown in Black Rock, which is part of Bridgeport, Connecticut, was a huge seaport back at the time in the 1850s. And he'd go back and forth to Newport, which is likely where he met Ida and asked to marry her. So she decided that she would indeed marry him. Obviously, the condition of marriage for a woman at the time was you had to live with your husband. So she had to leave the light, which she didn't want to do, but she did. And there's nothing about her at all from 1870 to 1872. She's not in the papers because she physically wasn't in Newport. She left him in 1872 to go back to Lime Rock because her father passed away. Her beloved father, her inspiration, her mentor, he died. And so she came back to Lime Rock Light. Zeradia had to take over as keeper. Her name is on the logs as keeper, but it's important to note, very important to note, that she was not officially appointed. This was a thing they did back then. Even though Jose is dead, the wife continued on, and that was for protective reasons, so she could continue to get paid and continue to have a home to live in. Well, this did not go unseen by Ida because she was fulfilling all of the responsibilities, and she's getting older now, and she's got a bad marriage under her belt, so husband is not a thing. He's not going to take care of her in her later life. And the newspapers, who still covered her regularly once she came back, they also speculated, what's the future for this woman? You know, and as she once said, every Mrs. Astor and every Mrs. Vanderbilt and every Mrs. Belmont you ever heard of called on me with a whole boatload of men and women that all talked to me at once and treated me as if I were a real queen. Well, she wasn't. She was a tourist attraction. They never invited her to tea. She never saw their houses. She never sat on one of the great, majestic lawns. Ida was just a worker. So It's kind of a sad side note to her story, because that's exactly how she was viewed, quite frankly, among the populace, even though she had all this fame in the papers. So she continued to be a popular topic in the newspapers and in blurbs, but as most celebrities, she started to, fade from view. And as she got older, into the 1870s now, she was very concerned about not having that appointment, because if she didn't get the appointment and her mother passed away, no house, no job, no money, no husband. What now? So all of this weighing on her mind, and the newspapers reminded her of this once in a while too. It's like, how long can you do this? You're in your 30s. The life expectancy for women is 50. How long are you going to be hauling men twice your size out of the icy waters who are drunk and fighting you to boot? In November of 1877, she rescued 3 drunk musicians from Fort Adams. What else is new? They attempted to take a boat across the water and they had sank. You know the story. Happens all the time for this poor woman. No wonder she was part of the temperance movement. Never drank. Now we know why. After this incident, Ida got very sick. She almost died. She got diphtheria, which is a bacterial infection, and it creates like a really thick mucous membrane, so it's very hard to breathe and very hard to swallow. In fact, she took a tablespoon of kerosene to clear it up. Tough sister, right? She was bedridden for months. The newspapers reported this. They hadn't seen her, and they were very concerned that she wasn't going to make it. So this, again, underscored her concern about the fact that, you know what, time is not on my side right now. And you can see some of the pictures here of, there's Ida in front of the lighthouse, by the way. So whether she realized it or not, Ida had acquired some very, very powerful acquaintances, people she never met, actually. As Nico pointed out, all of these generals came to see her after the Civil War. Why do you think that is? They were astounded at the fact that you had a female heroine who was saving people left and right, who wasn't on the battlefield. So they felt that they understood her at some sort of basic level. And the country really needed a heroine. They needed someone. They needed someone that they could look up to. And I think that also aided the fact that she became so famous so quickly. One of the people that she became a fan of hers was General Burnside's, as you can see him here. General Ambrose Burnside's known for sideburns. He was a Civil War general who went on to become a politician. Oh, shock. And at the time that Ida Lewis was in her late 30s, he was a U.S. senator. And he asked around, because his wife was a big fan of Ida Lewis's, and obviously from his home state. And he asked around and he said, why has this woman not been officially appointed lighthouse keeper? She is in service to her country. And nobody came up with an answer. So several months later, at his behest, she was officially appointed. It was January 21st, 1879. She was 37 years old. She was officially appointed, and this is the letter that he wrote to her, quite frankly, a copy of it. She was given the salary of $750, highest paid lighthouse keeper in the country, by a large amount, by the way. So, but this, the 1877 rescue was not her most harrowing rescue, even though it killed her. Her most harrowing rescue was yet to come, several years later, and that was on February 4th in 1881. And you'll see it here.
Yeah. So that rescue involved Giuseppe Giannetti and Freddie Tucker. They were privates stationed at Fort Adams who set out to cross the frozen harbor on foot to return to Fort Adams. Can you guess whether or not they were inebriated? Show of hands. Yes, they were. Ida and her mother were in the kitchen when they saw the men crossing the ice and watched as they fell through. So again, Ida dashed out the door with neither a coat on, no outer gear. She only grabbed a clothesline as she ran through the yard. Now, her mother fainted. Her sister Hattie tended to her, and Hattie shouted out to her brother Rudolph to come help Ida. Now, using the clothesline, Ida tried to pull the men out of the water. Both of them grabbed the line, which, they were panicking, and they tugged the rope, which pulled her onto thin ice. And so she ended up falling through the water. Now, remember, she's wearing a wool dress with a Victorian bustle, all of that weighing her down. And she never let go of the rope. And she was able to swim and shimmy back onto the ice and make her way back onto firm ice. And she returned to trying to help the men, and luckily one of them finally let go of the rope, and Ida was able to pull them out. And then Rudolph, her brother, showed up and arrived, and together they pulled both men out of the water, one of whom was nearly unconscious by that point. So her and her brother got both men back to the light and nursed them back to health, and they were both admitted to Newport Hospital, where they remained for several days before being discharged, both of them in good health, walking out of there. So on February 11th, 1881, just 7 days after that, Ida was awarded for her heroism for this particular rescue with the Gold Life-Saving Medal of the First Class. It's one of the oldest distinctions for bravery created by the United States Congress, and it was the first time that the honor has ever been bestowed upon a woman.
And this was, quite frankly, the highlight of her career because, as Nico and I know, the deposition, because in order to get this, they deposed everybody that was a witness to this, and they deposed her mother and her sister and the soldiers, and it's quite amazing when you read it. It's all handwritten, but you can see why. I mean, not many people could do this, all right? Just, look at the picture. It's quite astounding. So the later years of Ida were not the happiest. There's some photographs here. I call your attention to the three women. The woman in the middle is her mother, Zaradia. And then Ida is, I'm not sure where that is. She's closest to me. She's kind of to the left of her mom, and then Hattie, her sister, her younger sister, who ended up never marrying, and she died. She was very sickly. In fact, I think Ida had all the health in the damn family because they all pretty much didn't last very long. In Ida's twilight years, as we call them, she continued to rescue people. The official count is between 18 and 25. We know there were a lot more that were just never reported, quite frankly, because she never looked at the rescue as a big deal. It was just something she did. Her job was a lighthouse keeper. That's what she did. And the other thing was a side note. Oh yeah, people drowning. Yeah, pull them out. She had no clue at how unique that was. And even her dad, I think during that first rescue, correct me if I'm wrong, Nico, he said to her, "What are you, a fool? Let him drown." So, and that was his job. So it's like, even he thought she was nuts. As she aged, obviously her mother passed away, her sister passed away, her brother Hosea passed away. Rudolph continued to live with her at the light, but he was a fisherman by trade. He would help out now and again, but she single-handedly took care of everything. But her greatest joy, her greatest companion was the light. And she started to fade from limelight. The newspaper stopped sort of covering her. There were big changes in the Lighthouse Bureau. The bureaucracy was introduced even more so than before. Every report had to be done in triplicate. There are letters of, they're sort of reprimanding her, some of these clerks that she filed these reports to, saying, "You didn't do it right, we're going to cite you on a report to you." All of these things were very embarrassing to her. They were humiliating. They didn't care about her history. They didn't care who she was. She was just some old lady they were keeping around in a light. And they treated her as such. So all of these things, and if you think about how she had been treated up until then, she had been praised, she had been honored, she was famous, and now they're just tossing her aside, as fame does do. She was depressed. And her brother talked about it too, that in those latter years, she was also really concerned about electricity, because electricity, as you know, in the 1900s started to become a thing. Everyone was getting electricity, and she thought, "Ooh, they're going to discontinue this light. They're going to electrify it, and I'm not going to have a job." So these were all the things that were sort of weighing really heavily on Ida. So when the rumors of Lime Rock actually being abolished surfaced, and there was an article in the Newport News on October 19th, 1911, not electrified, but abolished, because they were considering it as sort of a useless maritime navigational aid. There were more important ones that had been developed. I think that really hit Ida hard, because 2 days later she suffered a massive stroke. It was October 21st of 1911. The War Department issued a notice to Fort Adams saying, "Please suspend your artillery practice. Ida Lewis is in grave danger, and we do not want to disturb her recovery." Unfortunately, she passed away on October 24th of 1911. She was 69 years old. Her brother said on her passing that was the way poor Ida wanted to leave the light when she left for good, in a casket. The funeral was held at Thames Street Episcopal Methodist Church. She was laid in state. She was really treated, that whole day was treated as a state holiday. Flags were hung at half-mast, her open casket, people could pass by. There were over 1,400 people attended the funeral. The lines went 75 yards out in either direction from the church. It was, in death, she was well loved. 2 months later, there was a groundswell movement from just folks that lived in Newport to change the name of the lighthouse from the Lime Rock Light to Ida Lewis Lighthouse. And it is the first and the only time in history that a lighthouse was named after a person, not a location or a shipwreck, to this day. The lighthouse was eventually decommissioned in 1927. There was one lighthouse keeper after her, and then it was closed down, and shortly after that, the yacht club took it over. That was then, this is now. Ida has been forgotten pretty much by history. She's not in any history books. You know about her because you live here. I wrote the book 20 years ago. She was chapters in books like The Woman Who Kept the Lights and things like that, but this was a phenomenal human being that had a phenomenal thing happen to her in a day and age where there wasn't the internet, there wasn't TV, there wasn't anything. Even though she's been sort of forgotten by the history books, the U.S. Coast Guard Academy, they remember her and they love her, and she is their personal hero. It is the Ida Lewis cutter is home ported here in Newport. Its responsibility spans from Long Island all the way up to Cape Cod. It is responsible for 348 navigational aids, not just one. I think she'd be very happy about that. And the Training Academy in Cape May, which I visited, I was able to speak there a while ago to their cadets. They have a massive, massive wall in their main hall that's got, it's a beautiful tile piece that sort of reconstructs the famous painting of her. They take her very seriously. In fact, they're the ones that commissioned to have her gravestone refurbished, which you can see in that photograph there. And so she also was the first woman to have a road named after her in Arlington Cemetery, which we think is super phenomenal. But that was then, and this is now, and so our goal, Nico and myself, is to bring Ida Lewis back to national conscience.
Which brings us to why I'm here. So I optioned the rights to Lenore's book in 2016 and have been pounding the pavement to get a film made about Ida Lewis ever since. And Lenore and I have become friends in the process. So my screenplay, which is entitled American Heroine, has been officially endorsed by the United States Coast Guard Motion Picture Office. They have pledged their production support once the film is financed. So what's happening with it? I live in Los Angeles. I'm a filmmaker who works out here. The script is making its rounds around Hollywood. So it's made its way to industry heavy hitters like director Michael Bay, producer Amy Pascal, who's the former head of Sony Studios. It was even being considered at one point by Elizabeth Moss's production company, the actress Elizabeth Moss from Handmaid's Tale. So people are reading it, people are considering it, it's getting out there, but it is a challenge to get any movie made. And that's especially true for historical period films. Why is that? Well, first of all, they're very expensive. Everything about a period film is fabricated, is not sort of, natural to our contemporary time period. So all of that costs money. And they are traditionally considered, awards films, prestige films. But unless you are Michael Bay and you take an event like Pearl Harbor and turn it into a summer blockbuster, they're not usually box office smashes. Plus, we're all still dealing with the fallout from the pandemic, which has changed the entertainment industry as it has shifted and changed a lot of industries. So the movie theaters are struggling, and studios and streamers aren't taking a lot of big risks right now, especially considering, I don't know how if you all have heard, but the Writers Guild of America is on strike right now against the studio system because they're not adapting to the way that things are changing, and it's creating a huge divide and a rift. And writers like me are struggling to, make a living just being screenwriters, because we have to change with the times and the ways that streamers have changed the system, and we have to update that. So there's a lot of tumultuousness in the business. So it's hard to get people who have the amount of money that we would need to make this feature to sign off on it. So what does that mean? It means that it becomes my burden to prove to them that this is a commercially viable film, that it won't break the bank, and that there is an audience for it, that there are people like us who want to see a movie about Ida Lewis and also just want to see films about lighthouse keepers that aren't like small art house films, but are sort of big scale, heroic, fun, compelling movie theater type fare, which is what I aim to make. So how do we do that? How do I prove to the studios and those holding the purse strings that this movie is viable and that we can make it? Well, I've partnered with Lenore, and I've also partnered with Jeremy D'Entremont, the president of the American Lighthouse Foundation, and we're going to make a short film. Now, as you know from my bio, this isn't my first rodeo. In addition to a major film that I wrote and directed that was released in 2020, I have a handful of short films that have screened around the world at over 50 film festivals that have won 20 awards. But this is really my most ambitious film yet. And it's called The Lighthouse Keeper's Wife. And it's inspired not only by the life and career of Ida Lewis, but also draws influence from other notable female keepers of the era like Abby Burgess and Kate Moore. So this is going to be a professionally produced short film with Hollywood production value, some recognizable actors, and we're going to shoot it locally in New England. That is my goal. So with collaboration from the American Lighthouse Foundation and the United States Lighthouse Society, we're currently in talks with the stewards of lighthouses on Wood Island, Curtis Island, and Burnt Island in Maine. And we're discussing details to determine which of these remote and cinematic locations are best suited for our production, which is really exciting. Everyone's pretty open to it so far, and we just sort of have to figure out like how to make it work. Now, much of this film also takes place in a small seaport hamlet on the coast. And so I'm in talks with the Mystic Seaport Museum to discuss the details of filming on the grounds there. Lenore and I are giving this lecture there in July. So we have an existing relationship. And I also grew up in Mystic. So yes, I'm pulling the hometown boy card to get some special consideration. But here's the deal with the short film project is we need your help. We are inviting the Ida Lewis and Lighthouse community at large to come get involved with us, because we're launching a fundraising campaign to help us get this project off the ground, starting with the funds that we need to secure these locations. For example, I have the Mystic Seaport Museum's like filming guidelines. They charge $5,000 a day to film at the Mystic Seaport, which is not an insignificant amount of money. So, once we have the light station and the Mystic Seaport confirmed and we have those locations locked in, then we can approach A-list actors and invite them to participate with us on this film. And by making the shorter film, we're going to bring attention to the Ida Lewis biopic so that we can finally bring her story to the big screen, which is traditionally how a lot of films do get made, is you make a shorter version that sort of harkens back to what you're trying to do to prove to everyone what the film's going to be so that they can get behind it. So I believe you all have flyers. There's a QR code on there that goes to our GoFundMe campaign. If you feel inspired to get involved, come be a part of it with us. I'm happy to answer more questions about the feature screenplay, the Ida Lewis biopic, or this new short film. And Lenore and I are going to keep talking about it and fundraising throughout our book tour this summer.
And we're going to have a Q&A directly after this for you have questions about Ida Lewis, whatever. We're happy to answer them. Just real quickly, this is the rest of the tour. We're still filling in dates. We're going to be kind of walking around, as Nico said. Nico will actually be in town. He is from Mystic, and so from the 17th until the 21st, he'll be with me, not on a screen. So it'll be kind of fun to actually not have
me in person.
That's right. And so, yeah, this is pretty much what we're doing, is trying to get this little film made in order to sort of to prove to people that it can be done. Just so you understand, too, and Nico kind of trained me in this. I'm not from film. I just write books. But he explained that when you shoot anything that's on the water, apparently it's super expensive, right? Is it liability, Nico? Something like that, too?
You could say, I think anytime anyone goes on the water, it's a liability. So when you're a film crew out there, it's a particular, actors and film crew with expensive equipment. Yes, you could say that.
About Jaws.
Yes, yes, he made that a long time ago too. And then finally, we have an Ida Lewis newsletter that we put together. We do it every month. So if you'd like to join, we have a sign-up sheet. You can also just use the flyer you have and just send us your email address, and we'll include you in the newsletter and keep you posted on what's going on with us and what's happening with the Ida Lewis movie just in general, and anything else you want to talk about. We want to turn it over to you now if you have any questions. And any that we can answer. I'm going to ask Kayla to bring your, Nico, you're going to be on full screen now. Yes, go ahead.
I'm surprised. I always thought the Ida Lewis Gotho was actually had a traditional Lighthouse style tower type. Is that indicative of just here, or was that the time and that was type of structures later?
Yeah, no, it was always, it's in, have you been to the yacht club? I'm sure there's yacht club members here. Yeah, it's in, it's right in the building. So Nico, he was asking about the Lighthouse, okay, and the way it's structured over at Lime Rock. It's never had a tower. It's been pardon?
Was that common, that error?
Well, it was a small lens. It was a small Fresnel lens, so it didn't really warrant a huge, right? And she just, yeah, that was the light, and probably why it was decommissioned so early, quite frankly. It was just for that harbor right there. I hope that answers that. Yes, sir.
Beyond the action of storms and life-saving, what part of her personality would you like to see drawn out that people aren't aware of?
What part of her personality do you want to see drawn out that people are not aware of about Ida Lewis other than her heroic acts? Nico?
That was the most fun part for me of writing a film about her. It's one thing for us to be in a room doing a lecture where we talk to you about what we've read about, but in writing a film about her, I had to figure out what her personality was. I had to figure out what her voice was. I had to get to know her family and sort of write in their voice. And I think what's particularly interesting about her, which Lenore and I have mentioned, is that she didn't really want any of this. She never intended to be famous. She never considered herself to be heroic. And she didn't really seek official appointment until she got famous for being the thing that was actually denied of her. And there's this shift that happens in her personality over the course of her story, where when she's younger, she's a little bit more soft-spoken. She doesn't draw attention to herself, and she kind of goes with the flow, and she doesn't speak out of turn. But as she gets older and as she's subjected to all this fame and all this attention, and then honestly, when she leaves Newport and then comes back later after her marriage and after her father dies and sees that her mother still was never really officially appointed, just kind of assumed the position, she becomes much more outspoken. There's this shift in her personality where it's almost like she finds confidence in herself. And that's when you start to see her say these things in the press that are a little bit more cutting, that have some salt in her words. And she kind of comes into her own, and she starts to demand what she deserves. And I think it's an interesting transition and evolution in her personality to mark over the course of her story, because she gets very salty by the end of her life in terms of talking about how she doesn't want men at the lighthouse. She prefers dogs. She talks poorly about the government and about the bureau. And so there's an interesting evolution to her character that happens if you really read between the lines and sort of see how her quotes evolve. That's something I would like to bring out, is that I think historically, when you look back on someone like Ida, you see this caricature version of someone, but you really get to see an evolution of a person that has been affected by fame and affected by what happened to them in their life and affected by that attention. And what does it look like to be on the receiving end of that kind of a fame at a time in which there wasn't fame, celebrities didn't really exist. That wasn't really a thing, but she kind of became one of the first tabloid celebrities, if you will. So to mark how that affected her relationship, I think is one of the more interesting things about her story, actually.
Thank you very much.
If you notice in the photographs that you saw of her, those are all posed photographs. She's holding the oar and she's doing all of this. That was not her idea. They wanted, people that were advising her at the time wanted to brand her as this strong, capable woman. And all of these things, it was almost like her image was being created, even way back then. And Nico and I have talked about this because she went from being sort of an innocent to sort of getting wise pretty quickly. She was all about, you know, we don't make much money here, kids, so don't send me. She'd got hundreds. There she is. That's the picture.
This was like her posing very uncomfortably. And even in the movie, I make a joke about how they made her hold the oar upside down because she would be like, what am I rowing on my head? Like, what is the point?
And she didn't own those clothes either, by the way. That would not have been anything she would have worn, obviously. But she got plenty of presents, and Nico touched upon that when he talked about the summer of 1869. She would get silk stockings. She would get all of, you know, these fancy things, and she's like, could you just send me cash? And that was basically what she was telling the newspapers. We need money, you know, we're not, especially when you think about it, if you do the math, 10,000 people over the course of a summer is between 500 and 600 people a day. Imagine being in your house and having all these people coming in and wanting a tour or wanting, you know, a piece of your hair or whatever it was. It was that type, and how that disruptive that is of your job and of your home. So we try to wrap our arms around that, but the change was phenomenal, and it had to have been something that completely took her off her mark, quite frankly. So yeah, there's a lot to mine there in Ida's life. Yes, ma'am.
Could somebody comment on items in the collection of Newport Historical Society that relate to Ida Lewis, please?
I'm sorry, what was the first part of that? Yeah, sorry.
Items that are the collection of the Historical Society
Yes.
that relate to Ida Lewis. I'd love to hear about that.
Yes, and the collection, the Historical Society that relate to Ida Lewis, Nico. There's some stuff in the case here that I think you guys had put out, right? And you have more too, don't you? Yeah, there's some things that she was gifted. Ida was very meticulous in her accounting. She kept a list of everything she got. She didn't toss anything away. She was given like a silver teapot from one of these societies. I don't have it off the top of my head. And they have some of her collection. Part of the challenge was when she died, she had everything in a box. And it wasn't really, you know, this was way before anything was really itemized very well, even though she had a great list of it. And I think she did bequeath some of it to the Historical Society, but it was a different animal back then. And I don't think anybody really realized how important a person she would become historically. She did, we know for a fact, have a framed photograph of Grace Darling over her bed. Grace Darling was a lighthouse keeper's daughter in the 1830s in the UK who rescued a bunch of people. She died shortly after that, but she was always compared to Grace Darling, and she really loved that. So she had a framed picture of her above her bed that meant quite a great deal to her. And I mean, Becca could probably speak more to what they actually have in their collection. I know they put some things out tonight for your display, so you could actually see some of the things. It's pretty impressive, though, because they do have some of the actual, you know, the deposition, for interest was very interesting to me to just see exactly what people said about that rescue. We don't really understand that unless you actually see how people recounted it. Yes, ma'am.
Did she divorce her husband, or like did they just get married for an untold amount of time?
She never divorced him. She made big, there's a question, Nico, about William Hurd Wilson. She married him, and before the marriage, when she talked to the papers, because remember at this point she's famous, okay? She's been engaged 3 years, she's famous, and she's like, I'm getting married, you know? And she kept saying, when I get married, I will be Mrs. Ida Wilson, which is his last name, and I will always go by that name. Well, that didn't last. She didn't go by that name. Legally, that was her name. But after a couple of years, if you read the newspaper articles and sort of see how she referred to herself, she reverted back to Lewis. We don't know what happened. I mean, there's all kinds of speculation. I mean, it wasn't uncommon for mariners to drink quite a bit. He could have been that kind of guy. He was the son of a carpenter. He was himself a for-hire captain. You know, he lived with his parents. They had a lovely home in Black Rock. It was right on the seafront. And father was making a lot of money by all accounts, and I don't know how much William made. We really don't know who he was, but he outlived her by 10 years. He died in a soldier and sailor's home on Long Island in 1921, but no one interviewed him. I mean, nothing I could find anyway, because I'm like, what's his side of this? So, no, she never divorced, and obviously she never remarried. Sort of sad. Yes?
I just wanted to comment about the suffragists.
Yes, ma'am.
At their conference here.
Yes.
in August of '69.
Yes.
They were in the middle of an internecine battle.
Yes.
And Elizabeth Cady Stanton and the New York suffragists were the ones that had a conference here. The Boston suffragists, Julie Ward Howe and people boycotted. So I think they really loved having Ida Lewis as this kind of non-controversial. At a time, it was just this horrible bloodletting over the
Yes.
14th Amendment to the Constitution over allowing African American men to vote. But so they went the day after the conference. Elizabeth Cady Stanton went out to visit Ida Lewis.
Yes, she did.
But the thing that I found so interesting in the write-ups in the suffrage material was that Ida Lewis continued doing her laundry while the suffragists were visiting.
That's true.
Because she said that, she said, sorry, but, I've got to do it.
She was unimpressed.
She was doing her housework while entertaining these suffragists. And I think they liked that, though, because it showed that you could be a real woman, but you also could go out and rescue
Yes.
people.
And I thank you for that footnote. I don't know, Nico, if you heard all of that. It was about Elizabeth Cady Stanton's.
Not really.
It was the history of the 14th Amendment, and you're absolutely right, so I thank you for that. And just really quickly, she never aligned herself with the movement, which Nico and I have discussed, like, wow, what a mistake that was, because here she's fighting for this official appointment, and if she had actually taken them up on their offer, which Elizabeth Cady Stanton said to her, will you be a part of this? Can we use you as the poster child for this convention? She's like, no, I'd rather rescue another person than have to sit through this again. She was apolitical, but in the end, it could have served her, honestly, to have aligned herself with the movement, and it would have served the movement too. I think we're at our end, right, Becca? So I want to thank you all for coming. Nico, we have to wrap it up now. And I want to thank the Newport Historical Society for giving us this venue and your beautiful faces and your attention.
Thank you all. This was really fun. Thank you for coming again. It was nice to see you within the confines of this screen. I've got a great view of these three gentlemen.